Astronauts to the moon.
Ignition sequence start. 3, 2, 1.
Houston, we have a problem.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue.
What you're seeing here is a mirage.
What's going on, everyone? It's Jaron from Jeranism, back with another video for you today. How Einstein Made the Earth Move. I'm going to be reading a 21-page PDF, which you can find a link to in the description. This is written in 2016 by Dr. Robert Sungenis, a known geocentrist. Many might know him as the executive producer of the movie The Principle, which, if you have yet to see that film, I highly recommend it. But Robert faces tons of criticism, well, as does anyone who questions the current model, but Robert also gets extra criticism, and in my mind, unfairly. As an example, let's take a look at the Wikipedia page for Robert Sungenis and notice a few statements to start. First, the opening sentence states, Robert Sungenis says when he was born is an American traditional Catholic, known for his Catholic apologetics and his advocacy of a pseudoscientific belief that the Earth is in the center of the universe. So, to begin, we've got a pretty much one-sided statement there claiming that his belief that the Earth is the center of the universe is a pseudoscientific belief. Well, we'll talk about that here in a second. Also, a little bit further down, you'll see what happens when you question the going narrative about alleged facts surrounding World War II. You'll be labeled an anti-Semite. So if you question the science you're given, it's pseudoscientific. Question the history you're taught and be labeled an anti-Semite. So you can see how safe it is professionally when you question the info that you're given through public education. Also, if we scroll down a little bit, we'll see under the title Geocentrism that according to Sungenis, he became interested in the pseudoscientific belief of does anybody really think that according to Sungenis, he became interested in the pseudoscientific? No, these are just words that have been input in this Wikipedia article to basically demonize Robert Sungenis. So the question becomes, is this belief really pseudoscience? Is it really pseudoscientific? Well, let's start by taking a look at what the definition of pseudoscience actually is. Alright, with a quick search, we can see that pseudoscience is defined as a collection of beliefs or practices mistakenly regarded as being based on the scientific method. Alright, and over to the right here, we see pseudoscience consists of statements, beliefs, or practices that are claimed to be both scientific and factual, but are incompatible with the scientific method. So, my hope is by the end of this article, by the end of this PDF, that you can decide for yourself which belief is truly pseudoscience. Which belief truly is incompatible with the scientific method? Is it the belief that the Earth moves, or that it does not? And so we just saw how biased this Wikipedia article can be. And so before I begin reading this PDF, let me start by saying that like all my videos, this video is for people like me searching for the truth. I always say, don't believe me, don't trust me, to do your own research, and I'll never stop saying that. But if you're a person who believes that what is in the mainstream and what we were all taught in school are the only facts, then you will hate this video and the PDF. You won't even listen, and we both know that that's true. So I invite you to move along because the following information will surely be something that is not taught in schools, and you will quickly see the reason. Nope, this video is for those seeking the truth. You will hear me say quotes by Einstein and other physicists who will tell you how they know that the Earth moves, or better said, how they don't know. Throughout this article, you're going to hear a term used quite a few times. That term is petitio principii. Okay, let's look up the definition of that. So, it is described by Merriam-Webster as a logical fallacy in which a premise is assumed to be true without warrant, or in which what is to be proved is implicitly taken for granted, otherwise known as begging the question. So again, this paper was written in 2016 by Robert Sungenis. The paper is very well written and completely sourced, so any quote that I read is sourced. If you download the PDF from the link in the description, you can find out exactly where that quote came from. Also, to get more details and many other important facts, you can obtain the DVD Journey to the Center of the Universe or the books Galileo Was Wrong and Geocentrism 101 at www.jttcotu.com. And so, without further ado, Albert Einstein, the Earth Mover, how Einstein made the Earth move when all the experiments showed it didn't move. In his 1881 and 1887 experiments, Albert Michelson discovered the Earth was not moving around the Sun. As Michelson himself described the results of his own experiment, this conclusion directly contradicts the explanation, which presupposes that the Earth moves. But since his colleagues, including Albert Einstein, were die-hard Copernicans who didn't want to believe that Michelson had discovered a motionless Earth, they proposed his experimental apparatus was distorted by the Earth's motion through space, and thus Michelson's apparatus only made it appear as if it wasn't moving. In scientific parlance, we call this the fallacy of petitio principii, that is, using as proof a moving Earth, the very thing one is trying to prove, a moving Earth. Let me explain. Michelson found that the Earth wasn't moving by using the speed of two light beams against one another. The first light beam was pointed westward because it was the presumed direction of the Earth's movement around the Sun. The second light beam was pointed northward and thus away from the direction of the presumed moving Earth. The first light beam should have been affected by the Earth's movement through space if it is the Earth that is moving around the Sun at the accepted speed of 66,000 miles per hour. If so, the first beam would have traveled slower than the second beam, but that didn't happen. Both light beams traveled at nearly the same speed. According to Michelson, the first beam traveled only about 1/6 of the retarded speed needed if the Earth was moving around the Sun. The conclusion, as Michelson notes above, should have been that the Earth isn't moving around the Sun. Other physicists have noted the same truth. There was just one alternative. The Earth's true velocity through space might happen to have been nil. Physicist Arthur Eddington. The data of Michelson-Morley was almost unbelievable. There was only one other possible conclusion to draw, that the Earth was at rest. Physicist Bernard Jaffe. Thus, failure of the Michelson-Morley to observe different speeds of light at different times of the year suggested that the Earth must be at rest. It was therefore the preferred frame for measuring absolute motion in space. Yet we have known since Galileo that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Why should it be at rest in space? Physicist Adolph Baker. The easiest explanation was that the Earth was fixed in the ether and that everything else in the universe moved with respect to the Earth and to the ether. Such an idea was not considered seriously, since it would mean in effect that our Earth occupied the omnipotent position in the universe, with all the other heavenly bodies paying homage by moving around it. Physicist James Coleman. The Michelson-Morley experiment confronted scientists with an embarrassing alternative. On the one hand, they could scrap the ether theory, which had explained so many things about electricity, magnetism, and light, or if they insisted on retaining the ether, they had to abandon the still more venerable Copernican theory that the Earth is in motion. To many physicists, it seemed almost easier to believe that the Earth stood still than that waves, light waves, electromagnetic waves, could exist without a medium to sustain them. It was a serious dilemma and one that split the scientific thought for over a quarter century. Many new hypotheses were advanced and rejected. The experiment was tried again by Morley and many others, with the same conclusion. The apparent velocity of the Earth through the ether was zero. Historian Lincoln Barnett, forward by Albert Einstein. What happened when the experiment was done in 1887? There was never in any orientation at any time of year any shift in the interference pattern. None. No shift, no fringe shift, nothing. What's the implication? Here was an experiment that was done to measure the speed of the Earth's motion through the ether. This was an experiment that was 10 times more sensitive than it needed to be. It could have detected speeds as low as 2 miles a second instead of the known 20 miles per second that the Earth as in its orbital motion around the Sun. It didn't detect it. What's the conclusion from the Michelson-Morley experiment? The implication is that the Earth is not moving. Physicist Richard Wolfson. Michelson and Morley found shifts in the interference fringes, but they were very much smaller than the size of the effect expected from the known orbital motion of the Earth. Physicist John D. Norton. This null result was one of the greatest puzzles of physicists at the end of the 19th century. One possibility was that velocity would be zero and no fringe shift would be expected. But this implies that the Earth is somehow a preferred object. Only with respect to the Earth would the speed of light be c as predicted by Maxwell's equations. This is tantamount to assuming that the Earth is the central body in the universe. Physicist Douglas C. Giancoli. But the die-hard Copernicans of that day were not about to accept the prima facie results of Michelson's experiment. They knew the catastrophic scientific, cultural, and religious implications if it was experimentally shown that the Earth is fixed in space. In a word, the whole world would have been turned upside down, literally and figuratively. Pressured to provide a scientific answer to the world, they searched for a way to make it appear that the first light beam did, indeed, provide 6/6 of the retarded speed required for an Earth moving around the Sun. To do so, they thought up of an ingenious but devious explanation. As noted above, they claimed the Earth's movement around the Sun contracted the metal enclosure in which the first light beam traveled. If the length of the housing is contracted, then the first light beam does not need to travel as far as when the housing is not contracted. This would account for why the speed of the two light beams did not differ much. With this contrived explanation, they proposed to the world that the contraction of Michelson's apparatus was the reason the Earth appeared to be motionless. In effect, if someone said to them, "You claim the Earth is moving, but you admit you cannot detect that movement by any experiment," They would retort, well, we can't detect it because every time we try and do so, the length of the experimental apparatus shrinks just enough to conceal the movement, which makes it impossible to measure the Earth's movement. Again, we see that the fallacy of petitio principii is in play. From start to finish, the whole enterprise was ad hoc. Length contraction wasn't even contemplated previously, much less was it as an established fact of science. But in this emergency situation, length contraction was invented on the spot so that the scientific establishment would have at least some hypothetical answer why Michelson's experiment showed that the Earth was motionless. Everyone could breathe a sigh of relief. The irony, as of this date, is that no one has ever detected a length contraction in a moving object. In fact, modern physicists can't even agree on what length contraction is or how it would be manifested. Since they insist that the Earth is moving around the Sun, yet cannot detect it moving, nevertheless, they needed some physical and mathematical way of accounting for it, since there is obviously a difference between motion and non-motion. So length contraction became their convenient scapegoat. This is the essence of the special relativity theory that Einstein invented in 1905. It was invented solely to answer Michelson's experiment, as Einstein himself said. To the question whether or not the motion of the Earth in space can be made perceptible in terrestrial experiments, we have already remarked that all attempts of this nature have led to a negative result. Before the theory of relativity was put forward, it was difficult to become reconciled to this negative result. Albert Einstein. Whereas in 1892, Hendrik Lorentz had hypothesized that the ether of space was what caused the contraction, Einstein decided to dispense with ether and attribute the cause to relative motion. In effect, Lorentz at least proposed a physical cause for his claims of length contraction, but Einstein never explained how relative motion could shrink objects. Hence, during his day, various philosophers accused him of violating the principle of cause and effect. So, whatever the cause of the contraction, in order to give the ad hoc theory some semblance of credibility, the required amount for the metal enclosure to contract was put into a mathematical equation called the Lorentz transform. It has become the most famous and most used equation in modern physics. Essentially, whatever tests disagreed with their belief that the Earth was moving around the Sun could now be mathematically transformed into their desired result, as well as give some semblance of being scientific. But the transform of length required another transform. Since they contracted the length, they also had to dilate the time. Since if a moving object has its length contracted, it is not going to get from point A to point B in the same time as when it was not contracted. So, to increase the time of travel, they use the same transform equation as above, but since they are increasing instead of decreasing, they turn the multiplier into a divider and get this. Of course, just as there is no proof that length contracts, there is no proof that time dilates. They just need it in order to make everything appear to balance, if they are going to insist that the Earth is moving around the Sun when the empirical evidence says it is not. It's easy for them. They just make up a theory and represent it by a mathematical equation to erase any discrepancies the experiment shows against their theory. The transforms are not over. They must also add mass increase, since if a moving object has its length contracted, then it would have a larger mass per unit volume when it gets to point B. So to make the mass larger, they use the same transform equation as for time dilation. Inertial frames. Often in the debate over the relevance of Michelson's experiments, the issue of inertial frames presents itself. An inertial frame is one in which an object is at rest or is moving in uniform motion and not accelerating or decelerating. If the Earth is moving around the Sun, it is a non-inertial frame since it is accelerating. Note: in physics, all objects that move in a circle are considered accelerating, even though they go the same speed. As such, one is hampered when doing experiments on Earth due to the effects of acceleration on the apparatus, a principle of which all scientists agree. So in order to make Michelson's experiment valid, that is, one that takes place in an inertial frame as if it were at rest, a relativist will create the inertial frame by the above transform equations. Once again, it's easy to see the fallacy of petitio principii at work in their thinking. For those who accept the prima facie results of Michelson's experiment that the Earth is not moving, the Earth is already shown to be an inertial frame because it is at absolute rest. Thus, there is no need to create inertial frames for the Earth, and thus no need to use transform equations. Residual ether. Incidentally, we should note one more important facet of the Michelson experiment before we move on. We saw above that the experiment showed only 1/6 of what was required for an Earth moving around the Sun. This 1/6 is important for another reason. It showed that space was composed of something substantive. The name given to it by Lorentz, Maxwell, and all other scientists was ether. No one knew precisely what it was composed of, but they correctly deduced that space cannot be nothing, since metaphysically nothing cannot exist. Space must be a something composed of something physical. although like air we cannot see it because it is invisible. It doesn't matter what you call it. The fact is that it must exist. Quantum mechanics has suggested that the ether's basic component is Planck particles, which are 20 orders of magnitude smaller than the electron. Another type of ether may be an electron-positron dipole particle, which was discovered in 1932 by Carl Anderson. In any case, the substance of space, which we will call ether, was detected in Michelson's 1881 and 1887 experiments, as well as his 1897 experiment with an above-ground apparatus. Since light moves so fast, it can serve to measure the effect on something as small as ether particles. His interferometer was so accurate it could measure 100 times more than it was required to measure. As such, Michelson's interferometer didn't measure enough ether to match an Earth moving at 66,000 miles per hour around the Sun, but it did measure a little ether. Otherwise, his results would not have shown 1/6 but 0/6 of the ether presence. Michelson noted this small presence in his 1887 paper. The actual displacement was certainly less than the 20th part of this and probably less than the 40th part, but since the displacement is proportional to the square of the velocity, the relative velocity of the Earth and the ether is probably less than 1/6 the Earth's orbital velocity, and certainly less than 1/4. This was not good for Einstein. He candidly admitted that if any ether was detected, even a little bit, his theory of special relativity would automatically be falsified. This was noted in Einstein's statement to Sir Herbert Samuel in Jerusalem. If Michelson-Morley is wrong, then relativity is wrong. In other words, Einstein was forced to assume that because Michelson did not find enough ether for an Earth revolving around the Sun, then Michelson couldn't have found any ether. But if this conclusion of Einstein's was wrong, then his whole relativity theory would be falsified automatically, since even a little ether would act as an absolute frame and thus nullify relativity. Noted physicist Charles Lane Poor of Columbia University reiterated the problem. The Michelson-Morley experiment forms the basis of the relativity theory. Einstein calls it decisive. If it should develop that there is a measurable ether drift, then the entire fabric of relativity theory would collapse like a house of cards. So Einstein was banking on the hope that since Michelson did not detect the required amount of ether for an Earth moving around the Sun, he could conclude that the ether simply didn't exist. Hence, the detection of the 1/6 of the required ether was thus conveniently chalked up to experimental error. The facts show otherwise, however. Every interferometer experiment performed from Michelson in 1881 to Jews in 1930, which is 50 years of the same results from a dozen different experimenters, detected 1/6 to 1/10. Einstein was so bothered by this fact that he hired what can be called as a scientific hitman, Robert Shankland, to seek to discredit the experiments, especially the most comprehensive interferometer experiments performed by Dayton Miller between 1908 and 1921. But at this point in time, the 1910s and 1920s, the world was only too happy to accept Einstein's theories and reject anyone who challenged them. After all, Einstein was the Earth mover. He made the Earth move around the Sun and thus saved mankind from having to admit that popular science had misled the world for the 500 years prior. For the geocentrists, the only thing left to answer is, from whence did this 1/6 of ether originate? The simple answer is that since the universe with its ether is rotating around a fixed Earth, some of that ether spilled into Michelson's 1887 interferometer when he was trying to detect if the Earth was moving around the Sun. This is confirmed by the fact that Michelson did another experiment in 1925 in order to measure the ether movement for the daily rotation between space and Earth. In that experiment, he found 6/6 of the required ether for a daily rotation. Hence, it is logical to assume that 1/6 he found in 1887 came from the same ether he later detected in his 1925 experiment. Since the ether in his 1887 experiment hit the interferometer orthogonally instead of linearly, it would only pick up 1/6 of the total ether in space. Electromagnetism. You will often hear modern devotees to Einstein claim that he invented special relativity as an answer to Maxwell's equations of electrodynamics. They do this because they don't want to admit that Einstein invented special relativity for the express purpose of making it appear that the Earth was moving around the Sun. They want to make it appear that Einstein invented special relativity out of pure motives and out of an independent thought process. The truth is far different. Einstein himself admits that the only reason he invented special relativity was due to Michelson's discovery. He writes in 1922, "Soon I came to the conclusion that our idea about the motion of the Earth with respect to the ether is incorrect, if we admit Michelson's null result as fact. This was the first path which led me to the special theory of relativity." Be that as it may, the reason that the relativist wants to intrude on Maxwell's electrodynamic theory is because, as it stands, electromagnetism doesn't show any characteristics of being relative. Maxwell's experiments from 1865 show us that the effect of an electric coil moving over a stationary magnet is different than a magnet moving over a stationary electric coil, and Maxwell appropriately represented these different reactions by two different equations. Maxwell's experiment and his two equations, actually four equations altogether, but with two main equations, thus show us that space and the reactions that occur in it are absolute, not relative, since it distinguishes between the two different effects of the electric coil and the magnet respectively. Since a relativist does not like anything absolute, Einstein sought to make Maxwell's experiment relative, just as he tried to make Michelson's experiment relative. To do so, he used the same transform equations that he used to make it appear that the Earth was moving. As such, the relativists can make it appear that the effect of electricity on magnetism is the same as magnetism on electricity, but in reality, they are not the same. We still use Maxwell's equations today because they are correct, but when the relativist uses them, he must invariably inject the transform equations in order to make Maxwell's two absolute reactions into Einstein's one relative reaction. Without the transform equation, Maxwell's findings are diametrically opposed to Einstein's relativity theory. Not surprisingly, Einstein was well aware that Maxwell's findings of the different reactions between an electric coil and a magnet are related to Michelson's unsuccessful attempt to discover any motion of the Earth. In his famous 1905 paper, he seeks to make their respective absolute effects into relative effects, i.e. the same, when he writes, "It is known that Maxwell's electrodynamics, as usually understood at the present time, when applied to moving bodies, leads to asymmetries which do not appear to be inherent in the phenomena. Take, for example, the reciprocal electrodynamic action of a magnet and a conductor. The observable phenomenon here depends only on the relative motion of the conductor and the magnet, whereas the customary view draws a sharp distinction between the two cases in which either the one or the other of these bodies is in motion. For if the magnet is in motion and the conductor at rest, there arises in the neighborhood of the magnet an electric field with a certain definite energy, producing a current at places where parts of the conductor are situated. But if that magnet is stationary and the conductor in motion, no electric field arises in the neighborhood of the magnet. In the conductor, however, we find an electromotive force, to which in itself there is no corresponding energy, but which gives rise, assuming equality of relative motion in the two cases discussed, to electric currents of the same path and intensity as those produced by the electric forces in the former case. Examples of this sort, together with the unsuccessful attempts to discover any motion of the Earth relatively in the light medium, suggests that the phenomenon of electrodynamics as well as mechanics possess no properties corresponding to the idea of absolute rest. They suggest rather, as has already been shown in the first order of small quantities, the same laws of electrodynamics and optics will be valid for all frames of reference, for which the equations of mechanics hold good. In other words, since Einstein firmly believes that the Earth is moving around the Sun, and yet he realizes that he must have an answer for all the unsuccessful attempts to discover any motion of the Earth, he proposes that this discrepancy can be dealt with by 1. Assuming as a fact that electrodynamics and mechanics did not show states of absolute rest, i.e., Michelson did not show us a motionless Earth, and Maxwell did not show us the absolute states of electricity and magnetism. And 2. We are thus obligated to change what appeared to be absolute frames in Michelson and Maxwell's experiments into relative frames, which is noted in his phrase, all frames of reference. In order to do so, that is, in order to make all frames of reference to be valid, Einstein will use the transform equation which appears on page 7 of his 1905 paper as follows. Or the same equation can be rewritten as, this is the precise equation used by Lorentz to claim that the arm of Michelson's apparatus had shrunk by 1 times 1 minus the velocity squared over the speed of light squared to the half, with Einstein also adding time dilation by 1 divided by 1 minus the velocity squared over the speed of light squared to the half. The section of this paper where this transform equation appears begins on page 5 with the title, Theory of the Transformation of Coordinates and Times from a Stationary System to Another System in Uniform Motion of Translation Relatively to the Former. Alas, we don't need to go searching for it. Einstein tells us quite candidly what he is doing. He is transforming space and time from a stationary system, example a fixed Earth, to another system, one of relativity. In fact, the word transformation appears 24 times in his paper, and he applies it to every phenomenon from time, space, motion, electricity, magnetism, the Doppler effect, stellar aberration, energy of light waves, electron acceleration, to mass increase. It became the quintessential means to relativize the whole universe and forever banish the thought of a motionless Earth. As we can see, it is all done by mathematics. There is not one iota of physical empirical proof to the theory. In the relativist's mind, of course, there is no need to prove their findings or to justify using the transform, since everyone knows the Earth is moving around the Sun. Then everything is moving and there is no object at rest, and thus the whole universe is relative. In effect, whenever the experiments show an absolute result, the relativist can wave his magic wand and change it into a relative result. This is the essence to the special relativity theory that Einstein invented in 1905. That Einstein believes the Earth is moving, but has no proof for it, is noted in his statement, "I have come to believe that the motion of the Earth cannot be detected by any optical experiment, though the Earth is revolving around the Sun." Einstein's admission merely begs the question, if, on a scientific basis, he can't detect the Earth moving, how does he know the Earth is moving? The truth is, he doesn't know. He just assumes it to be so, since that is what he has been taught since childhood. In effect, the transform equation is then invoked to make it appear as if the Earth is moving around the Sun, but in reality, the transform equation is just an equation and it has no ability or authority to determine the issue. Hence, Einstein would also admit in 1938, "The possibility of solving these difficulties depends on the answer to the following question. Can we formulate physical laws so that they are valid for all coordinate systems, not only those moving uniformly, but also those moving quite arbitrarily relative to each other? If this can be done, our difficulties will be over. We shall then be able to apply the laws of nature to any coordinate system." The struggle, so violent in the early days of science, between the views of Ptolemy and Copernicus would then be quite meaningless. Either coordinate system could be used for equal justification. The two sentences, "the sun is at rest and the earth moves," or "the sun moves and the earth is at rest," would simply mean two different conventions concerning two different coordinate systems. That is, he will employ arbitrary coordinate systems to make the absolute state, i.e. a fixed Earth, into a relative state, in which either coordinate system can then be used, i.e. a fixed Earth or a moving Earth. All the coordinate systems are created mathematically out of thin air by using the transform equation. If they didn't use the transform equation, then they would be stuck with only one coordinate system, the one Michelson found in 1887 when the experimental evidence showed that the Earth wasn't moving around the Sun. If you ask a relativist for the scientific validity of using the transform equation, he will simply retort, "Well, the transform equation was proven to be valid when Michelson did his experiment in 1887. Again, the fallacy of petitio principii is readily apparent since he is using an unproven fact, an Earth moving around the Sun, as the basis for making the conclusion that the Earth is moving around the Sun. The cause of the fallacy, as Einstein admitted above when he said, "Though the Earth is revolving around the Sun," is that they insist on using a moving Earth, which they claim to know intuitively, as the indisputable authority to interpret Michelson's experiment. Consequently, if one firmly believes that the Earth is moving, but the experiments show it is not moving, then one's interpretation of the experiment will force one to find some way to make it appear as if the Earth is moving. In effect, any experiment that shows the Earth is not moving will be mathematically transformed into a moving Earth by the transform equation. The transform equation is like a magician waving his wand over the experiments so that the system one does not prefer is transformed into the system one does prefer. Modern man certainly does not prefer a fixed Earth, since a fixed Earth would validate much of the history and science prior to the modern age, and would show modern man that he is not the objective and non-prejudiced icon of society that he has enjoyed the last few hundred years. He is little more than a magician who has been feeding the world a steady diet of illusions. Light as absolute. Speaking of illusions, we have one more to expose. In order to determine they have made a non-inertial frame into an inertial frame, which is hard to do if everything is relative, ironically, you need something absolute. You need an absolute measuring stick to determine the difference between the inertial and the non-inertial. They can't use the Earth, of course, because they have already insisted it is accelerating around the Sun. They can't use length, time, or mass because they have already said that they increase or decrease upon movement and thus are not absolute. The only candidate left is light. In order to make light an absolute measuring stick, they claim that its speed never changes, but there is no proof for it. They just assume it to be the case. Einstein called it a postulate. In this way, they make light serve as the one and only absolute in order to measure the amount of length contraction, time dilation, or mass increase, and even the rate that the Earth travels around the Sun. Again, this is the essence of special relativity. No proof, just made-up postulates and mathematical equations to give the appearance of truth. Einstein's transform equation, as you can see here, is interesting in itself. First, the easiest way to understand it is in the form of a ratio. We've often heard of a 1-to-1 ratio. Well, this equation was formulated to make the right side always less than a 1-to-1 ratio, since 1 multiplied or divided by any number less than itself will always be less than 1. The amount it will be less than 1 depends on the value of v. The higher v is, the higher beta will be. Second, small c, which represents the speed of light, is used in the denominator because it is believed to be constant and can thus serve as an absolute. Hence, v is always measured against a constant value for c, and v can never be higher than c because light is assumed to be the fastest known speed. If v ever equaled c, then the ratio would be 1-to-1. Of course, the relativists are assuming that c is always the same, but they have no proof of this claim. The relativist may retort, yes, light speed is constant but only in an inertial frame. It can vary in other frames. By doing so, he only traps himself. First, if light is constant only in an inertial frame, but an Earth going around the Sun is a non-inertial frame, then how can the relativist claim that the light beams used in Michelson's experiment on Earth were in an inertial frame? He can't, so he employs the transform equation. But in this case, the relativist has again committed the fallacy of petitio principii, using as proof an inertial frame by the very thing he is trying to prove, that transform equations create an inertial frame. Incidentally, one of the main questions relativists have never answered, although they have been challenged with it previously, is if the physical dimensions of length and mass can be contracted by movement, and the essence and calculation of time can be dilated by the same movement, then why isn't light contracted by a moving Earth? Since the relativist admits that light is a physical reality of photons, courtesy of Einstein, shouldn't they also be affected in the same way? This very question was posed to Einstein by Maxwell Abraham and August Foppel to the relativists, but without an answer forthcoming. In reality, the only reason light is kept immune from the effects of motion in the relativist scheme of things is because, ironic as it is, the relativist desperately needs an absolute to make everything else relative. In his mind, he has two choices for the required absolute. A, the fixed Earth that Michelson found, or B, the presumed constant speed of light that Einstein wants. If he chooses A as his absolute, it means B would vary. If he chooses B as his absolute, it means A would vary. But choosing A as the absolute would mean certain death for the scientific establishment, since it would affirm the Church's decision against Galileo. Choosing B would allow the charade of scientific authority over the Church to continue indefinitely. Which one do you think has a greater chance of being chosen by the reigning scientific establishment? The geocentrist says that the choice is easy. The prima facie evidence of the 1887 and 1925 Michelson experiments show the Earth isn't moving around the Sun, but there is a relative daily rotation between Earth and space. Hence, the Earth is the absolute inertial frame and the absolute measuring stick. If so, then the universe is absolute, not relative. Since the motionless Earth is already an absolute inertial frame, then there is no need to introduce ad hoc transform equations to turn it from a non-inertial frame into an inertial frame, and thus there is no need to contract length, to dilate time, or to increase mass. No magic is required for geocentrism. Additionally, they cannot assume the speed of light is constant or unaffected by motion, since if the Earth isn't moving, then there's no way for them to make such a determination from Michelson's two experiments, especially when other experiments and evidence, example Sagnac in 1913, and the GPS system that shows a 50 nanosecond difference of light speed going east to west, show light speed is not constant. It is obvious that the relativist is making these unproven ad hoc transform adjustments simply because he refuses to believe that Michelson's 1887 experiment showed the Earth is at rest. Modern versions of Michelson's experiment. One more thing. Relativists who believe that Michelson's 1887 experiment showed no difference in the speed of the two light beams claim that Michelson's null result has been verified by modern versions of Michelson's experiment that show no difference between the speed of light beams up to 10 to the negative 18 precision. But if you want to see a shell game, this is it. The modern experiments only trap the relativists more firmly than Michelson did. Remember above we said that Einstein maintained that the slight difference in the two light beams of Michelson's original 1887 experiment can be chalked up to experimental error? In effect, Einstein was claiming that there was no difference in the speed of the two light beams, and the result was thus null. For the sake of argument, let's assume that to be the case. Hence, if the speed of light beams was the same, what did this suggest to Einstein? It suggested the Earth wasn't moving. We already saw that Michelson himself said about the presumed null result, namely, this conclusion directly contradicts the explanation, which presupposes that the Earth moves, as well as the other scientists we quoted after him. For further verification, let's look at what Einstein's biographer said. In the United States, Albert Michelson and Edward Morley had performed an experiment which confronted scientists with an appalling choice. Designed to show the existence of the ether, it had yielded a null result, leaving science with the alternatives of tossing aside the key to which had helped them explain the phenomenon of electricity, magnetism, and light, or of deciding that the Earth was not in fact moving at all. The problem which now faced science was considerable, for there seemed to be only three alternatives. The first was that the Earth was standing still, which meant scuttling the whole Copernican theory and was unthinkable. So if the new sapphire oscillator confirms that the two beams go the same speed, it doesn't relieve the relativist one bit. In fact, it traps him all the more, since now an even more sophisticated and precise experiment confirms that the Earth isn't going around the Sun, since the light beam in the oscillator that was supposed to be affected by the Earth's movement is not affected. But instead of admitting, or at least holding out the possibility, that this result shows the Earth isn't moving, they instead claim that the 66,000 mile per hour speed has no effect on the light beam, and therefore they conclude that the Earth could be moving and the light beam is constant, regardless that its frame is moving at 66,000 miles per hour. For them, the choice is a fixed Earth or a fixed light speed, and they have chosen the latter because a fixed Earth was, quote-unquote, unthinkable. But when they make such a choice, they must also conclude that special relativity allows both a moving sun around a stationary Earth and a moving Earth around a stationary sun. As the article itself admits, according to special relativity, there is no absolute space or absolute time. So if two objects are moving relative to each other in empty space, it would actually be impossible for an observer to tell their absolute velocities. Maybe only one of the objects was moving and the other was stationary, for example, but you wouldn't know which was which because their movements are relative to each other, not to any external reference frame, assuming the reference frame is non-accelerating. Notice the corner into which the relativist has painted himself. What they discovered is that there is a price to pay for choosing a fixed light speed over a fixed Earth. With a fixed Earth, one knows the universe is absolute, since the universe revolves around an absolute fixed point, and everything can be accurately measured from that fixed point. But with a fixed light speed, there is no fixed point, and no one knows whether the Earth is moving around the Sun or the Sun is moving around the Earth. Obviously, if they claim that light speed is not affected by movement, then they can't use light to determine movement, and thus all movement is undeterminable. In effect, for all its bravado and sophistication, science is forced to conclude that science can't answer the simple question of which is moving around the other, the Earth or the Sun. But the problems are not over for the relativist. If he can't determine the precise motion by using light, then he must account for his inability, since it is a fact that out of the two possibilities, i.e. the Sun moving around the Earth or the Earth moving around the Sun, only one can be true reality. So he resigns himself, based on other criteria, mostly philosophical, to believing that the Earth moving around the Sun is the true reality, but he is incapable of proving it. The best he can hope for is a draw due to his incompetence. Another issue concerns the length contraction, the time dilation, and the mass increase of the original Lorentz and Einsteinian theories. Do these effects apply to the Sapphire oscillators? If they do, then the Lorentz transform must be used to arrive at a null result if they insist that the Earth is moving around the Sun. If the three effects are discarded, then so must Einstein's theories. The only question left to answer is, why did Michelson's 1887 experiment show at least some ether? Example, Michelson said it showed 1/6, but the Sapphire oscillators don't show any ether down to 10 to the negative 18. The reason is quite simple. The Sapphire oscillators are put in an extreme vacuum which essentially removes the ether that Michelson discovered. Michelson did not use a vacuum. In effect, the relativists have to create an artificial environment in order to obtain a null result. In the real world, however, the one without a vacuum, some ether always shows up in the Michelson-type experiments. In fact, in Michelson's 1925 experiment, all the ether in space shows up in the experiment. In the end, it really doesn't matter, since if the oscillator shows no difference in the light beams, then it shows precisely what Einstein believed Michelson showed, namely, the Earth isn't moving. The only way out of this dilemma was to claim that the interferometer shrunk and that time dilated, but these were nothing more than pulling a rabbit out of a hat. Consequently, if the Earth were moving, we would expect there to be a significant difference in the speed of the two light beams, just as Michelson found. One way to test the Sapphire oscillator's capability is to position it on the frame of a 1925 Michelson-Gale experiment apparatus instead of an 1887 Michelson-Morley apparatus. A significant difference in the oscillator's results may be seen. The reason, of course, is that in 1925, Michelson found 98% of the ether he needed to confirm a daily relative rotation between the Earth and space, but in 1887, Michelson only found a fraction of the ether he needed for an Earth revolving around the Sun, since some of the rotational ether spilled into the 1887 Michelson apparatus. The geocentrist says that this is precisely what should be expected, since the Earth is not revolving around the Sun, but ethereal space, which makes up the universe, is daily rotating around a fixed Earth. If on a Michelson-Gale frame the oscillator shows no difference in the speed of the light beams, this would prove that the oscillator cannot detect the relative rotation between Earth and space, but we know positively that there is a relative rotation, and thus show why it is also not able to detect whether the Earth is moving around the Sun. It would prove the oscillator to be inert and discount it as being capable of detecting celestial movement. It would then disqualify it from being used to determine that light speed is constant and also disqualify it from claiming Lorentz symmetry. We could also put a Sapphire oscillator on a GPS frame to determine whether its results are valid. Presently, light beams sent from GPS stations in the east to GPS stations in the west are faster than light beams sent from the GPS stations in the west to GPS stations in the east by at least 50 nanoseconds every day, all day. This discrepancy is covered up by relativists since they can pre-program the GPS computers to adjust the difference so that they can then claim that the light speed is constant according to the special theory of relativity. In effect, the GPS shows that light speed is not invariant and there is no Lorentz symmetry. If the oscillator is capable of detecting the difference, it would detect the 50 nanoseconds. Since we know for a fact that there is a 50 nanosecond difference, then if the oscillator cannot detect it, then either the oscillator is being hampered by its vacuum state, or the oscillator simply can't be used to measure the light speed differences. Incidentally, the geocentrist can explain the 50 nanosecond discrepancy, since he holds that because space is daily rotating east to west against a fixed Earth, the inertial frame of the GPS light beam sent east to west is moving westward by 1,054 miles per hour by the fact that space is rotating around the Earth, thus adding space's rotational speed to the light beam speed. Conversely, the GPS light beam traveling west to east must travel against the east to west frame of space's daily rotation, and thus it will be slower than the east to west light beam. Back to Maxwell's equations. If, as one relativist claimed, special relativity is for inertial frames of reference, a non-accelerating frame of reference, they are the equations which keep the laws of electromagnetism invariant, he is being deceptive, as is much of physics today. He is making it sound as if there is some necessity to make the effect of an electric coil moving against a magnet to be the same effect, invariant, as a magnet moving against the electric coil. His necessity, of course, is nothing more than his desire for a backup argument for relativity after he had already relativized Michelson's experiment. But Maxwell showed quite conclusively that his results were not invariant. They are variant because nature is what it is. Since the effects are not invariant, then the universe is absolute, not relative. Special relativity, because it seeks to promote a relative universe to hide the fixed Earth that Michelson found, can't tolerate the absoluteness of Maxwell's experimental results, so it uses its mathematical magic, the transform equation, to make Maxwell's results relative. Deep in his heart, the relativist realizes that if Maxwell's equations are left absolute, it means that special relativity cannot be applied to Michelson's experiment, and thus Michelson's finding that the Earth is motionless would be valid. But the relativist would rather die 1,000 deaths than accept a motionless Earth. It is unthinkable. So he commandeers an untested, unproven, ad hoc concept, example, length contraction, and its accompanying mathematical equation, the transform equation, to make it all go away. Einstein is famous for one thing. He is the man who made it all go away, and the world has worshipped him ever since. He did so by making the whole universe relative when in fact the empirical evidence clearly showed him that the universe was absolute. All in all, the history of the Michelson experiment shows how a preconceived idea, example, the Earth moves around the sun, is made the sole determining factor of how a modern scientist is going to interpret the results of any experiment. In order to hold on to his preconceived idea, he will introduce mitigating factors onto the experimental results, and usually this is done by hypothetical concepts and fudged mathematics. The scientist thus convinces himself that because he can invent a mathematical equation that can transform the empirical results, that he can keep his preconceived idea of how he thinks the universe must operate. In his mind, the ends justify the means because he knows that the Earth revolves around the sun. There was nothing that would make mankind happier than to keep believing that the Earth moved around the sun, regardless of what the experiment showed. Otherwise, they would have to bow to the Pope of the Catholic Church for condemning Galileo as the same error. Their God from on high, Albert Einstein, showed them a magical way to avoid such a predicament, and the world has accepted Einstein as a god ever since. His transform equation has become the magic wand to turn an Earth-fixed absolute universe into an Earth-wandering relative universe. As the noted Einstein biographer Abraham Pius put it, a new man appears abruptly, the suddenly famous Dr. Einstein. He carries the message of a new order in the universe. He is a new Moses come down from the mountain to bring the law, and a new Joshua controlling the motion of heavenly bodies. The new man, who appears at the time, represents order and power. He becomes the divine man of the 20th century. Robert Sungenis, August 9th, 2016. All right, I hope you enjoyed that. And if after reading that you still want to believe that the Earth moves at all, that's on you. When deciding which belief is pseudoscience, ask yourself which belief is based on empirical and scientific observations and actual experiments, and which belief brings in mathematical transform equations to make it appear like the scientific method was used. Ultimately here, there really is no question. It comes down to your worldview. If you want to believe that the Earth flies through space, math will get you there. Science will not. If you want to believe things based on observations, well, there is only one choice, and it's the one that doesn't employ length and mass contraction and time dilation, which have never been shown to exist. So clearly, Robert and I agree on the geocentric universe. Our differences are, of course, that he believes in a sphere Earth suspended in space while the whole universe goes around it, and I believe the Earth is all that there is. And as of this date, no curvature of Earth can be found. I believe that just as these scientists have used mathematical equations to hide the Earth's central location, I also believe that these scientists have used the same trickery to hide an even bigger error, that the earth is flat and stationary, and that no person is standing upside down beneath you. It's required in their worldview, and so it's up to you to realize the truth, because these scientists were after the truth, sure, as long as the earth is a sphere flying around the sun. So go outside today and look up, and you'll see that the sun moves, that's clear, and not the earth. Unless you hate the idea, in which case you worship Einstein for his mathematical ability to make the earth move with these transform equations. So that's how Einstein made the earth move. Thanks first to all my patrons. You guys are the ones that make this possible for me to do this. I remind everyone to do your own research, because when you do, you'll never again believe what you've been taught. This has been Jeranism, and until next time, peace.